On the morning of September 21st, 1863, Braxton Bragg stood among the wreckage of a battlefield he had just won and made a decision that would haunt the Confederacy for the rest of the war. His army had spent 2 days tearing through the Army of the Cumberland at Chickamauga Creek. The Union line had collapsed. Rosecrans had fled the field in a panic. Thousands of Federal soldiers lay dead or wounded in the Georgia brush, and the remainder were staggering north through mountain gaps, leaderless and broken, retreating toward the Tennessee river town of Chattanooga. Bragg had cavalry. He had momentum. He had an enemy on the run. And he did nothing. He did not pursue. He did not cut off the retreat. He allowed the battered remnants of a routed Union army to walk unmolested into a city ringed by mountains, and then he followed at a pace that suggested he had already won everything worth winning. What he did not understand, what he seemed constitutionally incapable of understanding, was that the campaign had not ended at Chickamauga. It was continuing. And the decision he made that morning set in motion a sequence of events that would strip him of everything he thought he had gained. Chattanooga was not merely a town. Sitting at the bend of the Tennessee River, flanked by Lookout Mountain to the southwest and Missionary Ridge to the east, it was the gateway to the Confederate interior. Hold it, and the Union held the key to Georgia, Alabama, and the supply arteries that kept Confederate armies in the field. Lose it, and the South would be cut in half again, this time irreparably. Both sides understood this. The problem for Bragg was that understanding geography is not the same as knowing what to do with it. By late September, his army had occupied the commanding heights. Lookout Mountain rose more than 1,400 feet above the valley floor, and from its northern face, Confederate artillery could reach virtually every road and supply line running into the city. Missionary Ridge, running roughly parallel to the Tennessee River, formed a second wall. The Union Army was penned inside Chattanooga on 3 sides, with the river at its back. Bragg had positioned his forces along those ridges and settled in for a siege. From the outside, it looked like the Confederacy had finally solved its tactical problem in the Western theater. They had the high ground, the interior position, and a trapped army beneath them. All they had to do was squeeze. What followed over the next several weeks was one of the stranger episodes in American military history. Not a story of Union brilliance overwhelming Confederate defenses, but a story of how one man's inability to lead, to inspire, or even to tolerate the men around him turned an almost certain Confederate victory into one of the most complete reversals of the entire war. The Army of Tennessee had a problem that predated Chickamauga, and the victory there did nothing to solve it. Braxton Bragg was one of the most reliably despised officers in either army. He was rigid, argumentative, prone to illness, and possessed of a vindictive streak that made subordinates dread his attention. His generals, men like Leonidas Polk, Simon Buckner, D.H. Hill, Thomas Hindman, had been filing complaints about him for months. After Chickamauga, the complaints turned into open insurrection. Within days of the battle, a group of Bragg's senior officers signed a formal petition calling for his removal and sent it directly to Jefferson Davis. This was not a quiet grumbling through back channels. These were corps commanders, men who had just fought under him and won, formally declaring in writing that they had no confidence in their commanding general's ability to prosecute the campaign. Polk went further, accusing Bragg of failing to pursue after the battle and claiming the army had been robbed of a decisive result by Bragg's hesitation. Nathan Bedford Forrest, the cavalry commander whose riders had been among the most effective forces at Chickamauga, confronted Bragg personally. He had been ordered, in the weeks after the battle, to give up several of his regiments to be consolidated under another officer, a decision that Forrest read correctly as punishment for his continued advocacy for an aggressive pursuit. He rode to headquarters, dismounted, walked into Bragg's tent, and delivered a rebuke that witnesses remembered for decades. He told Bragg that he was a coward, that he had robbed the army of a victory it had paid for in blood, and that if Bragg ever tried to interfere with his command again, Forrest would not be held responsible for what happened next. Then he turned around and left. Bragg did nothing. He filed no charges. He made no reprimand. He wrote a brief note to Richmond acknowledging the confrontation and noting that it would be best, under the circumstances, if Forrest were transferred to a separate command. The transfer was granted. The Confederacy thus removed from the Chattanooga siege its most aggressive cavalry commander because its commanding general could not function in the same organization as a man who had told him the truth. Jefferson Davis traveled to Chattanooga in early October to resolve the situation. What he found was a command structure that had essentially fractured along every seam. He assembled Bragg and his senior generals together and asked each man, in Bragg's presence, whether he had confidence in the commanding general. The accounts of what happened in that room are among the more striking documents of the war. Longstreet, who was, at this point, the highest-ranked Confederate officer present who was not a full general, said plainly that he did not believe Bragg capable of handling the army. Buckner said the same. Hill expressed doubts so fundamental that they amounted to the same verdict. Bragg sat and listened to this, and apparently said very little. Davis, having heard his generals condemn their commander to his face, sided with Bragg. He reassigned the most troublesome critics, accepted Polk's resignation, effectively drove D.H. Hill out of the army, and departed, leaving Bragg in command of an organization whose senior leadership despised him more intensely than they had before Davis arrived to adjudicate the matter. This mattered tactically because a siege requires coordination, initiative, and the willingness of subordinates to execute aggressively when opportunity arises. None of those things were present in the Army of Tennessee in the fall of 1863. Bragg's generals were not looking for ways to tighten the noose around Chattanooga. They were watching their commander for signs of weakness, nursing grievances, and protecting their own positions. The siege that looked so promising on paper was, at its human core, already failing. Inside Chattanooga, the situation was genuinely dire. The Union supply line ran along a single winding road through the mountains to the north, 60 miles of rutted track that was barely passable in good weather and nearly useless in rain. Confederate cavalry had been raiding it regularly, burning wagons and driving off horses. By mid-October, the men of the Army of the Cumberland were on quarter rations. Horses were dying by the hundreds, not from disease, but from starvation, their carcasses piling up in the streets of the city. Soldiers were detailed to follow supply wagons and collect whatever grain spilled from the sacks. Officers wrote home describing men who had not had a full meal in 2 weeks. The Army's chief quartermaster calculated that at the existing rate of attrition, they had perhaps 3 weeks before the horses were gone entirely, the artillery became immobile, and the Army effectively ceased to function as a military force. William Rosecrans, the commanding general, was coming apart under the pressure. His dispatches to Washington grew increasingly erratic, lurching between requests for supplies and requests for guidance, and occasional passages that read as though written by a man who had stopped sleeping. He telegraphed one message essentially asking for permission to surrender the city. The War Department had seen enough. On October 16th, Ulysses Grant was given command of all Union forces in the Western Theater and ordered immediately to Chattanooga. He arrived at the end of a brutal horseback ride through mountain rain on October 23rd, limping from a recent injury, his uniform soaked and muddy. Within 2 days, he had approved a plan that would become known as the Cracker Line, a combined overland and river operation to open a new, shorter supply route into the city through Brown's Ferry on the Tennessee River. The plan had been developed by William "Baldy" Smith, the Army of the Cumberland's chief engineer, and it was elegant in its simplicity. A force would float silently downriver at night on pontoon boats, surprise the Confederate pickets at Brown's Ferry before dawn, establish a bridgehead, and hold it long enough to swing a pontoon bridge across the river. Simultaneously, a column would march overland through a gap in Raccoon Mountain and link up with the river force on the south bank. If it worked, the new supply route would be less than a third the length of the old one and largely beyond the reach of Confederate interference. It worked. On the night of October 26th, a detachment of Federal soldiers floated downriver in the darkness without making a sound, hit the Confederate pickets at Brown's Ferry before they could respond, and secured the south bank by dawn. 2 days later, after some fighting at a place called Wauhatchie, the Cracker Line was open. The first steamboat arrived the following day. Grant was standing on the wharf when it came in. The men watching it unload its cargo of hardtack and grain were, by multiple accounts, openly weeping. Now consider what this operation meant from Bragg's position. He had an army on the high ground. He had artillery that could reach the Tennessee River. He had infantry positioned on Raccoon Mountain directly above the route the Union forces would need to use. And the Federal Army, weakened, starving, and led by a general who was weeks away from being relieved, had executed a night river assault, an overland march, and a bridgehead operation under his nose. The Confederate response at Wauhatchie was confused, poorly coordinated, and ultimately driven back by Union forces that, on paper, had no business driving anything back. Bragg's explanation, such as it was, amounted to the claim that he had not expected the Federals to attempt it. This is not a defense. It is a confession. The Cracker Line changed the strategic calculus entirely. Grant now had men who could be fed and rested. He had a stable supply route. He had Hooker's Corps arriving from the east, fresh troops who had seen nothing of the Chickamauga disaster. He had Sherman's Army of the Tennessee, several corps strong, marching toward Chattanooga from Memphis. Bragg, meanwhile, was about to make the decision that put the seal on everything. On November 4th, Bragg detached James Longstreet, the best corps commander in his army, the man who had delivered the decisive blow at Chickamauga, and sent him north toward Knoxville to capture Ambrose Burnside's Union force. The stated reasons were strategic. Knoxville needed to be taken, Burnside needed to be neutralized, and the capture would extend Confederate control across East Tennessee. The actual reasons were more personal. Longstreet had been among the loudest voices calling for Bragg's removal. He had written to Richmond, spoken to Davis, and made no effort to conceal his contempt for Bragg's leadership. The two men had reached the point where they could barely communicate without the exchange curdling into something between a formal dispute and a personal vendetta. Sending Longstreet away solved a command friction even if it created a military catastrophe. The men who remained with Bragg on Missionary Ridge understood immediately what the detachment meant. Longstreet had taken roughly 15,000 soldiers, nearly a third of the effective strength of the Army of Tennessee. The force that had been besieging Chattanooga was now thin enough that aggressive Federal action might actually crack it. Grant understood this as well. He had been planning his offensive for weeks. Longstreet's departure simply told him the time had come. The Union assault began on November 23rd with an attack on a small rise called Orchard Knob, a Confederate outpost position in the valley between Chattanooga and Missionary Ridge. Grant intended it partly as a reconnaissance in force, partly to shorten his lines. What he did not expect was that Thomas's men would take it in under an hour. The Confederates barely contested it. Grant stood on the ramparts and watched the assault go forward and remarked afterward that the men of the Army of the Cumberland seemed to have something to prove. They did. Chickamauga sat on them like a weight, and Orchard Knob was the first exhale. The following day, Joe Hooker's corps attacked Lookout Mountain from below. an assault that, given the mountain's height and the fog that rolled in during the morning, became known almost immediately as the Battle Above the Clouds. The fighting was real, the terrain was brutal, and the Confederates were driven up and over the mountain through the afternoon and into the night. By dawn on November 25th, soldiers from Ohio and Pennsylvania were flying the American flag from the summit. The strategic justification for besieging Chattanooga from the southwest was gone. What remained was Missionary Ridge, and it was here that the battle became something that military historians have spent over a century trying to adequately explain. Bragg's defensive alignment on Missionary Ridge was, by the judgment of virtually every officer who examined it afterward, something between incompetent and inexplicable. The ridge was steep enough that an assault up its face was widely considered near suicidal. But Bragg had divided his forces into 3 lines. A line at the base of the ridge to contest the valley approaches, a line partway up to provide additional resistance, a line at the crest to hold the summit. In theory, the 3 lines could support each other. In practice, the line at the base could not retreat without exposing the line at the middle to flanking fire, and the line at the crest could not depress its artillery enough to hit targets at the foot of the slope. The defenders at each level were largely isolated from those above and below them. On the morning of November 25th, Grant ordered Sherman to assault the northern end of the ridge while Hooker swept from the south. Thomas's Army of the Cumberland, positioned in the center, was ordered to take the Confederate rifle pits at the base of the ridge, nothing more. That was the limit of their orders. Sherman's assault went badly from the start. He attacked what he believed was the northern end of Missionary Ridge and discovered, too late, that it was a detached hill separated from the main ridge by a deep ravine. His men spent the day throwing themselves against a position they could not take, taking heavy casualties from Patrick Cleburne's Confederates, who held the real northern end with professional efficiency. By afternoon, the plan Grant had designed was broken in its most critical component. He needed a diversion. He ordered Thomas to send his men forward to take the rifle pits at the base of the ridge. Thomas turned to his corps commanders. The corps commanders turned to their divisional commanders. And somewhere in that chain of transmission, between the order and the execution, something happened that no one ordered and no one could fully explain. The men went to the rifle pits and took them. Then they kept going. No order was given to assault the ridge itself. Grant watched from Orchard Knob, and, according to the accounts of the officers beside him, his face went tight. He turned to Thomas and asked who had ordered those men up the ridge. Thomas said he had not. Gordon Granger, commanding the corps most visibly climbing the slope, said he had not. Grant said quietly that if it went wrong, someone was going to answer for it. The men were already 200 feet up. What was happening on that slope was not a coordinated military assault. It was an improvised, almost feral surge by men who had been told for 2 months that they had been beaten, that they were trapped, that they owed their survival to the Army of the Potomac's reinforcements and a general who had been sent to save them. They were not interested in taking rifle pits. They were interested in settling something. Men from Indiana and Illinois and Ohio climbed because the man next to them was climbing, because stopping partway up a contested ridge in the open felt more dangerous than continuing, because the Confederate fire from the crest was, improbably, less lethal than it had any right to be, and because, in some way that none of them wrote about cleanly in their letters home, they needed this. Chickamauga was 2 months behind them, and it would not stay there. The Confederate line at the crest watched them come and could not do much about it. The defensive position that Bragg had been convinced was impregnable had the artillery problem that his own engineers had warned about. The guns could not depress far enough to hit men scrambling up the slope directly below them. The infantry at the top could fire, but the ridgeline was so narrow in places that the men at the crest were firing almost straight down, and the men climbing were using folds in the terrain, boulders, fallen trees, the bodies of their own dead, anything that provided cover from above. They came up in dozens of different places simultaneously, converging toward the crest from angles the defenders could not all cover at once. When the Union soldiers reached the top, and they reached it at multiple points within minutes of each other, the Confederate line broke. Not a fighting withdrawal, not a tactical redeployment. It broke. Men who had held the line for weeks, men who had watched the Union Army starve beneath them and believed they were in an unassailable position, threw down their rifles and ran. Bragg rode along the crest trying to rally them. He was nearly captured. The route moved south along the ridge faster than mounted officers could outpace it, thousands of Confederate soldiers pouring off the eastern face and into the valley below, leaving guns, wagons, equipment, and the bodies of their officers behind them. Grant watched it from Orchard Knob and said nothing for a long moment. Then he rode forward. Bragg managed to establish a rear guard at a gap called Ringgold, where Cleburne's division, the same men who had stopped Sherman cold all day on the northern end of the ridge, fought a delaying action savage enough to halt the Union pursuit and allow the remnants of the Army of Tennessee to stumble south into Georgia. The fighting at Ringgold Gap lasted only a few hours, but it cost the pursuing Federals enough casualties that Grant ordered the chase called off. It was, in a perverse sense, a final demonstration of what the Army of Tennessee was capable of when led by someone who knew what he was doing. Cleburne's men held that gap with the same professionalism they had shown all campaign. The tragedy for the Confederacy was that they had been wasted for 6 weeks defending a position their commanding general had already surrendered through mismanagement, sent to stop a pursuit that never should have been necessary. The casualty numbers tell part of the story. Over the 3 days of fighting around Chattanooga, the Union lost roughly 5,800 men. The Confederates lost nearly 6,700. And more critically, they lost 40 artillery pieces, thousands of small arms, the high ground they had held for 2 months, and whatever remained of the Army of Tennessee's cohesion as a fighting force. Bragg submitted his resignation within days. Jefferson Davis, who had backed him through months of complaints and the October confrontation and the dismissal of his critics, finally accepted it. The post-mortems came fast, and they have not really stopped. Bragg spent the rest of the war defending his record in a series of increasingly bitter official reports, each one finding fresh culprits for the disaster. Breckinridge for drinking, Stevenson for mishandling the Missionary Ridge position, Hardee for failing to coordinate. What the reports never addressed, because they could not address it without dismantling the entire edifice of Bragg's self-understanding, was the fundamental question that hangs over the whole campaign. He had Grant's army trapped. He knew it. His subordinates knew it. The men in the rifle pits knew it. The horses dying in the streets of Chattanooga knew it. For 6 weeks, the Army of the Cumberland sat in a city it could not be adequately supplied, surrounded on 3 sides by an army that held every piece of high ground within artillery range. All Bragg had to do was maintain the position, deny the supply routes, and wait. The Confederacy in the fall of 1863 had few advantages it could point to in the Western theater. It had this one. And Bragg managed it so poorly, through vendettas with his own officers, through defensive arrangements that defied military logic, through the inexplicable decision to send Longstreet away, that the trapped army not only escaped, but turned around and drove him off the mountain. Grant would write in his memoirs that the Confederate position around Chattanooga, properly defended, should have been nearly impregnable.
He did not say this as a compliment. He said it as an analysis of what he had been facing, and what, by the time he finished his work in November 1863, it had turned out to be worth. What the Chattanooga campaign ultimately reveals is something that military history tends to undervalue because it is harder to chart on maps than troop positions and artillery ranges. Armies are not machines. They are collections of men, and the character of the man at the top, not just his tactical intelligence, but his ability to command loyalty, to convert subordinates into collaborators, to hold a fractious organization together through weeks of grinding inaction, determines what those armies can actually do. Bragg's army on those ridges in October and November of 1863 was superior in position to almost anything that Grant could throw at it. It was inferior in every human dimension. It was led by a man its officers despised and its men did not trust, executing a strategy of passive strangulation that required exactly the kind of cohesion its command structure had already destroyed.
Grant understood armies differently. He understood that men who had been starved and humiliated and told for 2 months that they were beaten carried something in them that needed a direction. He gave them a direction. He did not give them the order to charge up Missionary Ridge. Nobody gave that order. But he had created the conditions in which men like that were willing to do it anyway, without orders, without certainty of survival, because something in the equation of the campaign had become more important to them than surviving it. Bragg went to Richmond. Grant went to Virginia. Chattanooga passed into Union hands permanently. The gateway to the Confederate interior swung open, and Sherman began planning his march to Atlanta. The siege that was supposed to restore Confederate fortunes in the West had instead exhausted them. The trapped army that was supposed to wither on the mountain had instead climbed it. Braxton Bragg had held every card in the deck for 6 weeks. He played them badly enough that his opponent walked away with the pot.